Okay, welcome everyone. This is our first Keiser Live session. Welcome to Anatomy and Physiology. I'm Dr. Stephen Lindner. And today is our first lecture. We're going to cover the introductory concept to anatomy and physiology. And when we look at the term anatomy and physiology, it's important to understand what these terms mean. The concept of anatomy really is about describing the structure of the human body, whereas physiology is really understanding human function. So now we mention anatomy and physiology, we're talking about the study of structure and function. And we say that structure determines function, and functioning happens to maintain structure. So it's kind of like a two-way street here. When we look at anatomy, it's what things are made of within the human body, where they're located, all the different structures. And we can look at anatomy and study anatomy through, we could look at structure through an X-ray, through an MRI, through a CAT scan, ultrasound, palpation, by touch, by visualization and observation. And physiology is the function, how things are functioning. There are lots of dynamic studies that we could look at to determine how things are functioning. We can look at blood chemistry as well to see how things are functioning. So structure determines function. Now, when we study human structure and we look at an individual, here we see this young lady standing in anatomical position. She's standing with her feet flat on the floor. She's standing erect. Her arms are at her side. The palms are facing forward, eyes straight ahead. This term is referred to as anatomical position. Okay? And it's the reference point that we start at when we start looking at other terms, different terminology like medial, lateral, superior, inferior, proximal, distal, anterior, posterior. We have to start in anatomical position when using a lot of these other terms that I'll spend some time going over today. So we can look at superficial anatomy. When you look at Index A and Index B in your textbook, I believe, comes after Chapter 10. You'll look at superficial anatomy of the different body parts, maybe superficial anatomy of the arm or the thigh or the leg or even the abdomen or chest. And it's important to know what structures are deep as well as superficial. Superficial is looking at the skin surface, and deep is when we start peeling away layer by layer and looking deeper below the skin. So when we talk about anatomical landmarks, the position that we saw before with that young lady was anatomical position. That was standing with the feet flat on the floor, hands at the side, palms facing anterior, which also means facing forward. There's two opposing terms, supine and prone. Supine is lying down face up. I like to say supine is lying on your spine, whereas prone is lying on your bone, on your nose, lying face down. So supine is lying down face up or lying on your spine. Supine is lying on your spine, and prone is lying face down on your bone. So in this particular picture, I've seen this show up several times on Connect on some lab quizzes over the last several terms. And when you look at this, you'll see the person is lying face down. So what describes this term? Is it anatomical position? No. Is it fetal position? No. Typically, there's two terms that are always opposites, prone and supine, and they're testing your knowledge if you know the difference. So when you're lying on the bone, on the nose, you are lying prone. I've also seen a type of question show up like this, where in this particular case, lying on the spine is lying supine, and they have these drag and drop, like there's you know, several choices on one side. You have to click and drag them and drop them as one of the exercises. So lying supine is also lying face up, and it is the opposite of prone. If we look at the bottom picture, that's prone, that's lying face down, and that's the opposite of supine. In the middle picture, here's the individual standing in anatomical position, which is standing upright with feet flat on the floor. Okay, easy enough, straightforward, just some basic terminology and basic concepts. Furthermore, when we look at anatomy, we can say there's microscopic anatomy, where we're looking at things that we cannot see with the naked eye. We need a microscope to see it, such as cells and tissues. So the term cytology, when we look at the word cyte, C-Y-T, that means cell. You can hear that word like hepatocyte. Hepa is liver, so hepatocyte is a liver cell. How about osteocyte? Osteo is bone, so osteocyte is a bone cell. How about a chondrocyte? Chondro is cartilage, so chondrocyte is a cartilage cell. How about a cardiomyocyte? Cardio is heart, myo is muscle, so cardiomyocyte is a heart muscle cell. All right, so whenever you see the word cyte, it refers to cell. So cytology is the study of the cells. When we take a bunch of cells and we bring them together, we create tissues. And the study of tissues is histology. That's histology. Now let's look at how life is organized, right? So if we start at the smallest level here, we have chemistry. We have atoms, we have molecules, we have elements like carbon and oxygen and hydrogen and nitrogen. We have carbohydrates, proteins, fats, right? Those are chemicals, or at the molecular level. So we're made of chemistry, right? Those carbons, the oxygens, the hydrogens, the way they organize is also structure. And the way these things are structured determines their function. A carbohydrate is structured different than a protein. A protein is structured different than a fat. So anyway, we have chemistry, which is kind of like the smallest level, and then chemistry, our chemicals come together and create cells, right? So cells are just a group of atoms and molecules that come together. And then cells come together and make tissues, and then tissues come together and make organs, like the heart, the liver, the kidney, the stomach. Those are organs. And then organs come together and they make systems, like your digestive system, the neural system, the cardiovascular system, the immune system, the reproductive system, okay, the endocrine system, the muscular system, the axial skeletal, right, the skeletal system. So we have 11 systems. And then all the systems come together, and they're going to create the crowning creation of all the organism. So if we look at this and pool it together, we have chemicals and molecules. These are the smallest elements, right? Atoms and all these molecules come together, and we have proteins and fats and carbohydrates. So these chemicals come together to create a cell. And then the cells come together and make tissues. This type of tissue looks like muscle tissue. And then muscle tissue can come together, or tissues come together to create an organ. And then organs of similar structure and function come together and make a system. In this case, we have the heart, along with the arteries and the veins and the capillaries and all the blood vessels. And you have the cardiovascular system, right? Cardio is heart, vascular is blood vessel, the cardiovascular system. And then that system with the other systems create the organism. So I've seen this show up on several exams in the past on Connect. So again, it's click and drag. So we have in these pictures describing certain organs or systems, then you have to drag the appropriate term that describes that system. In this particular case, we're looking at the skeleton. The central part is the axial skeleton, and everything outside of that, like the upper extremity and the lower extremity, that would be the appendicular skeleton. But either way, this is the skeletal system. Here we have the brain and the spinal cord and the nerves. That would be the nervous system. Here it looks like the upper airway, and then you have the lungs. So this is the respiratory tract, or the respiratory system. Here we have the heart with the associated blood vessels. That's the circulatory system. Here we have the kidneys, the two ureters, and the urinary bladder. That's the urinary system. Don't confuse the term ureters with urethra. They're different. The way I tell my students to remember it is you have two kidneys, right? Two kidneys, 1, 2. And then the word ureter, there are two E's. So each kidney has a ureter that leads from the kidney to the urinary bladder. The urethra is where urine flows out for excretion of the waste products. Here we have some other systems. So here we're looking at, looks like the liver, the stomach, the small intestines, the colon. So that's the digestive system. Here looks like the whole body, but really it's looking at the skin and the hair, the skin. That's called the integumentary system, or the integument, which is really skin, hair, and nails. The outer protective system, your first line of defense for your immune system, is the integument. And we have some little glands in here, like the pancreas, the kidneys, the thyroid gland, the thymus, looks like the pineal gland, the pituitary gland. So these are part of the endocrine system. The endocrine system produces hormones. Here we're looking at a whole bunch of muscles, so that's the muscular system. And here is the lymphatic system. It's looking at lymph nodes, like cervical lymph nodes and axillary lymph nodes in the armpit, and inguinal lymph nodes, the spleen. These are all lymph nodes, so part of the lymphatic system. So let's take a look at some of the different systems. One of the first systems that we'll get into is the integumentary system. This is one that I believe is discussed within the first week, because we're going to be starting with the cells, well, chemistry, and then the cell, and then we do tissues. And I will send out a lecture. Let me see, is tissues next week? I think tissues may be I think tissues is week 2. My bad. Tissues are week 2. But after we cover the 4 types of tissues, which is epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle, and nerve, after those 4 tissues are covered, we get into the integumentary system, which has all 4 types of tissues. The skin actually has epithelial tissue, it's got connective tissue, it's got muscle tissue and nerve within it. So it's one of the first systems that we will get into. We'll cover in week 2, we will cover the bones, and we'll cover the skin, hair, and nails in week 2. So the integument really is skin, hair, nails, and your sweat glands. And the function of the integument is to protect us against environmental hazards. It's going to help regulate body temperature. When it gets too warm, your body's going to perspire to cool it off. We have little hairs on our arms and our legs to provide sensory information to our neural system. Then we have a skeletal system. The skeletal system is broken up into 2, what we see centrally located, like the skull, the spine, the rib cage, the sacrum, and coccyx. That's going to be the axial skeleton. And then the appendicular skeleton would be the upper extremity, including the scapula, and then the lower extremity, including the pelvis and the pelvic girdle. So you have an axial and an appendicular skeleton. So you have bones, cartilage, ligaments, bone marrow, all part of the skeletal system. And bones are really, really important because that's where muscles are going to attach. And when muscles contract, it helps to move our bones. So it helps us to locomote and to move. The bones also provide protection for us. I mean, if you look at the skull, there's no other part of the body that protects organs like the skull does, right? It's a helmet that protects the brain. If we look at the 24 individual vertebrae, they're going to protect the spinal cord. So very important in terms of protection. The bones also act as a reservoir, meaning it's a bank in which we can store calcium and other minerals. So when we eat food, we're going to use vitamins and minerals for metabolic function, but when we don't need all of those minerals anymore, we put some in storage just in case we're in a fasting state. The body has a reserve to tap into. And then whatever the body doesn't need anymore, we can excrete out through urination and through bowel movements. So the bones are really important in terms of storage, especially calcium. And the bones also have bone marrow, so we form bone cells there. We form red blood cells. The production of red blood cells is referred to as erythropoiesis. Erythropoiesis means red blood cell producing. And there's also white blood cells that are produced in the bone marrow called B cells, right? There's T cells, which are produced by the thymus, that's T for thymus, and then there's B cells for the bone marrow. Those are both white blood cells, WBCs, or leukocytes. Okay, so now this is a question I've seen pop up in the past, right? So what is the highlighted structure? And the choices are appendicular skeleton, peripheral skeleton, central skeleton, or axial skeleton. Well, you didn't hear me teach you anything about peripheral skeleton. You didn't hear me say central skeleton. You did hear me say axial versus appendicular. So axial is everything in the center, and what's not highlighted in blue is the appendicular skeleton. Those are the two appropriate and acceptable terms when we talk about osteology. All right, let's talk about muscles. There are three different types of muscle tissue in the body. There is skeletal muscle, which is everything you see here in the picture. These are muscles that attach to your skeleton. There's cardiac muscle, which relates to the heart. And the third type of muscle is called smooth muscle. Now, skeletal muscle that attaches to your skeleton is voluntarily controlled. You can consciously control your skeletal muscles, right? You can say, okay, biceps contract, and then your arm moves. You can say upper trapezius contract, and then your scapulas elevate. So that's voluntary and consciously controlled. Your heart, your cardiac muscle, you can't voluntarily control it, right? I mean, through time, I suppose if you meditate and listen to relaxing music and right? If you meditate and get yourself to a state, you can slow your heart rate down, absolutely, but you can't do it instantly. Not like a contraction of your bicep. Over time, you can do that. So the cardiac muscle is really known as involuntary muscle. Smooth muscle is also involuntary. Smooth muscle lines your arteries, like your blood vessels. Smooth muscle can constrict your arteries or dilate your arteries. It's around your colon and your intestines. Your trachea, your windpipe, can constrict and dilate, right? If it constricts, if your trachea constricts, you have like wheezing, like asthma. And if it dilates and opens up, you can get more oxygen into your system. What else is smooth muscle? The uterus, right? A woman's uterus contracts involuntarily during that time of month, right? When the monthly bill comes and your menses come, you have contractions of the uterus and it's uncomfortable. You can't voluntarily control it. Well, it just so happens during that time of month, what is it that most women crave? Usually chocolate, right? Sometimes dark chocolate, right? Chocolate is very rich in magnesium, and magnesium is a natural muscle relaxant, right? That's why women crave that. It just naturally relaxes the cramping of the uterus. Okay, so here in this case, the skeletal muscle is going to contract and provide movement because it attaches to bones. Muscles also provide protection, like the abdominal muscles here are going to protect the abdominal organs. We do have the pectoralis muscle here that can protect the heart. We do have muscles around the neck that protect the blood vessels surrounding the neck. When muscles contract, they do generate heat. We know when we exercise, the body gets warm and then you perspire to cool your body off. We know if someone has a fever of, let's say, 103, 104, even 105 degrees, what happens to that person? They want to get under the covers because they're shivering, right? They're shaking like this. And as they're shaking, they generate more heat, so the fever can go up even more. In the Northeast, where I live, if we go outside and it's 30 degrees and I'm wearing shorts, I could probably handle it for about 10 minutes, 15 minutes. Then after a while, I get a little bit cold and I start to shiver to generate heat. This is what happens when most people get, let's say, a stiff neck, where maybe they come out of the shower or the bath and their hair is wet and maybe their neck is wet and they fall asleep with the air conditioner blowing on them or the fan. What's happening there is the cold is blowing on them and their sternocleidomastoid, the SCM, and all the cervical muscles are firing. They're in this quivering, shivering fit. Why? To generate heat, except you're sleeping and not aware of it. So from that muscle shivering and quivering and going into like spasms for 6-7 hours would be like you being at the gym exercising your muscles for 6-7 hours. What would happen to your muscles if you exercised your biceps for 6-7 hours? You wouldn't be able to move it the next day. Well, what do you think happens to the SCM when these muscles are shivering all night for 6-7 hours? If a fan was blowing on you and your body is trying to heat up and it's shivering, the next day you're not going to be able to move your neck. All right, so that helps you understand what happens with stiff neck and muscle spasms. Okay, going back to fever. We have a lot of parents in the room, and I want to bring a lot of parents to ease, especially with fever. I have 3 children myself, and most parents do get a little bit concerned our children have a little bit of a fever, but I want you to rest assured that fever is a healthy reaction for the body, whereas the nervous system, the hypothalamus, says, hey, there is a bacteria, hey, there's a virus, and these things can thrive at 97 degrees or 98 degrees Fahrenheit. So let's spike the body temperature to act as an incinerator to try and kill off and burn off the bacteria or the virus. So most parents get concerned, oh, it's 100, 101, 102, 103, and they get nervous and they want to give their child a Tylenol or an aspirin, and then it brings the fever down and they feel better. But you don't strengthen the immune system, you actually harm it. You're training it, and not training it in a good way, right? It's kind of like a short-term benefit for a long-term negative consequence, which isn't the best. Muscles can only get stronger with resistance, right? When you go to the gym and you train your muscles, they get stronger. A heart gets stronger with cardiovascular exercise. Your brain gets stronger with resistance of learning information. Your immune system gets stronger when it's challenged. So I remember when my son was 3 or 4, he had a fever of about 105, pretty high up. And I just stayed with him. He had croup, he had a bad viral infection. I just watched his lips, his body. I could cook an egg on it. It was that hot. Stayed with him, cooled him off a little bit with a cool compress. And as long as my children were able to sleep, we didn't do anything. If sleep was disturbed, then we would give a little bit right through the tush, like we would break off a little bit. You put a little bit through the tush, it dissolves, gets into the system, and their fever could go from, let's say, 106 to 105, and then they'd sleep. And they'd wake up in a puddle of water. They just burned it off. So the concern is, oh, brain cells will die, and it's just you can't let the fever get too high because of brain cell dying and people hallucinating and whatnot. But the research shows that brain cells die at 107.9, 107.9. Right? You know what the weather gets like in Arizona sometimes, 110, 115, 120, right? The body is resilient. But if that internal temperature gets to 107.9, that's where we get a little bit concerned, okay? But the body knows what it's doing. Even if that fever rises at 104, 105, if the body wants it to go even higher, guess what it does? It rolls the eyes back, the muscles go into a spasming seizure, and we call that a febrile seizure. And what happens during a febrile seizure? The muscles shake and generate more heat. The innate intelligence of the body knows exactly what it's doing. So here in this picture, now it's saying, well, what are we looking at here? Well, it's definitely muscles, but what are the choices? Axial muscles or appendicular muscles? So they're testing two for the price of one here. Axial, just like the axial skeleton. The axial is the head, the neck, and the trunk. And the appendicular muscles, much like the appendicular skeleton, is the periphery, the upper extremity and the lower extremity. The neural system, the brain and the spinal cord, is the central neural system. And then all of the nerves that come off of the spinal cord is part of the peripheral neural system. Neural system forms at about day 18 or so after sperm and egg come together. The neural system is the very, very first system that forms. Most people think it's the cardiovascular system because during sonograms, during pregnancy, they look for the heartbeat for life, when in actuality, the nervous system forms before the heart. This is why many people see a doctor of chiropractic. It's because they want to make sure that when the brain sends messages down the spinal cord, those messages can exit, go to the nerves, which feed every organ and every muscle and tissue of the body. So you want to make sure that the structure centrally is moving well and is structured well. So if the structure is good, the physiology is good, the function. If the anatomy is good, the physiology is good. Good structure, good function. The neural system is responsible for taking in information, processes that information, and sends out a motor command. When sensory information comes in, the body processes it and sends out a motor command. That's the function of the neural system. So here we're looking at the brain and the spinal cord. That is the control center. That is Houston control. When we look at the endocrine system we will cover during week 4. We'll do the endocrine system and reproductive system. The endocrine system is very close cousins to the neural system. The neural system controls and coordinates functions through chemicals known as neurotransmitters, but the endocrine system controls functions by creating these chemicals that are sent out to the bloodstream called hormones. So hormones are very, very powerful. Organs like the pituitary gland, the pancreas, gonads like the testes and the ovaries, the thyroid gland, the adrenal gland. These are just a few examples of, of organs that can create hormones. The endocrine system can direct long-term changes in the activities of other organ systems. The endocrine system is involved in adjusting metabolic activity and energy use by the body. The thyroid controls your metabolism. If it's working too fast, that's a overactive thyroid. And if it's working too slow, it's hypoactive thyroid. When it's hyperactive, these are people that eat, and can never put on a pound. And when it's hyperactive, these are people that just look at an ice cream sundae and put on 2 pounds. Okay. The endocrine system is also controlling many structural and functional changes during sexual development. Okay. So when we look here, we're looking at, this is the thyroid gland with the parathyroids behind it. Here are the 2 kidneys with the adrenal glands above. Here's the pancreas, thymus, thyroid. Here's the uterus, fallopian tubes, and the ovaries. So they're wanting to know what this highlighted blue structure is right here. That's going to be the pancreas. The liver is not even shown, but that would be up here, right upper quadrant. The adrenal glands, if you look at the word adrenal, it's ad and renal. So renal refers to like renal failure, kidney failure. When you add something to the kidneys, that's this and this. The only possibility is the pancreas. The pancreas is actually mixed gland because it has endocrine and exocrine function. Endocrine function because it produces insulin glucagon, which regulates blood sugar, but it also produces digestive enzymes to help break down proteins, carbohydrates, and fat. So that's exocrine function. We'll look at the cardiovascular system. This is something you do in A&P2. Talk about the heart, the blood, and the blood vessels. Purpose of the cardiovascular system is to distribute blood cells, water, dissolved materials, including nutrients, waste products, oxygen, carbon dioxide, and blood is also, blood vessels are used to distribute heat and assist control of body temperature. This right here, when we look at the blue, the highlighted structure, is it the aorta? Nope, this is the aorta right here, coming off the heart. So this blue structure is the heart. This is the abdominal aorta here. And then we have these common iliac arteries here. The purpose of the heart is to pump blood, oxygenated blood, head and upper extremity, as well as all the abdominal organs, the lower extremity. And when all the oxygen is gone, that deoxygenated blood has to pump back to the heart. The heart will pump to the lungs, it picks up more oxygen, and the oxygen blood from the lungs will find a way back to the heart, beat once again to bring blood to the brain and the upper extremity and the abdominal organs and the lower extremity. Lymphatic system, a parallel circulatory system, spleen, thymus, all your lymphatic vessels, lymphatic nodes, your tonsil. The lymphatic system is to help defend against infection, disease, and will then return clean fluid back to the bloodstream. The respiratory system can be divided into an upper respiratory tract and a lower respiratory tract. So we have the nasal cavities, your sinuses, the larynx, trachea, bronchi, lungs, and alveoli. And the main function of the respiratory tract is really to deliver air into the alveoli and provide oxygen to the bloodstream, and then remove the waste products, which is carbon dioxide, and get it out of the body. We want to take in oxygen and give off CO2. The only reason why we breathe in oxygen is to drive that oxygen to the mitochondria of the cell to produce ATP, to produce energy. ATP is adenosine triphosphate. So here in the blue is the upper respiratory tract. You ever hear when someone has an upper respiratory tract infection or they have a lower respiratory tract infection? So this right here is part of the upper respiratory tract. Everything from this point down is the lower respiratory tract. Okay, the GI tract. The GI stands for gastrointestinal, same thing as digestive system. From a mechanical perspective, it starts in the mouth. We have teeth, the tongue, the pharynx, the esophagus, stomach, small intestine, large intestine, liver, gallbladder, and pancreas, all major organs of the GI tract. The teeth and the tongue and the esophagus and the stomach and the small and large intestine, these are main digestive organs. Then you have like liver and gallbladder. These are accessory organs. They're not main, right? Food is not passing through them, but they're accessory organs because they provide a lot of digestive enzymes to break down the food in the main GI tract. Think of it that way. Where does digestion really begin? Most people think it begins in the mouth, but really it begins in the brain, right? Because you can think of Ma's cooking, you can think of grandma's soup, her chicken, whatever her famous dish is, her pumpkin pie or something, right? You can think about it, and just by thinking about it, you can produce digestive enzymes and you can start salivating. We know that most digestive disorders and eating disorders also take place in the brain, in the hypothalamus. We know many body image disorders take place in the brain. So digestion does take place in the brain because your eyes can see food, your nose can smell it. These are all cranial nerves that send information into the brain. So the digestive system is going to process and digest the food. It's going to absorb and conserve water as well as nutrients, and it's going to store energy. When we look here at the blue structure, so here's the mouth, right? Here's the tongue. We have some salivary glands up here. Here's the esophagus leading into the stomach. Here's the liver. Next to the liver is that green gallbladder. Food empties from the stomach into the small intestine, which is the blue, and then it leaves the small intestine and goes into the large intestine, which is here. This is the ascending colon, transverse colon, descending colon, rectum, and then the anus. So the blue is the small intestine. Small intestine comes in three flavors because there's three parts to it. There's the duodenum, jejunum, and ileum. Duodenum, jejunum, and ileum, DJI. Now, so the small intestine was the last one here. Now we have this blue structure, which is the LI, the large intestine, also known as the colon. Again, this is the ascending colon, transverse colon, descending colon, where the swirl is right here. That's called the sigmoid colon. Then you have the rectum and the anus. Okay, now here we're looking at parts of the mouth. It looks like the salivary glands here, looks like the pancreas, it looks like the liver and the gallbladder. So is that the digestive tract? Is that the accessory digestive organs? So remember, the digestive tract is going to be the mouth, the esophagus, the stomach, small intestine, and large intestine. These other parts are accessory organs. So the accessory digestive organs are here in blue. Your urinary tract, which are the kidneys, the ureters, the urinary bladder, the urethra, these function to clean out the blood. They're going to remove any waste products from the blood. They regulate water balance. They store urine. And it helps to regulate blood ion concentrations and pH. pH stands for percent or potential hydrogen. The more hydrogen that is found in any type of solvent, the lower the pH, meaning anything from 0 to 6.9999999, that's an acid. 7.0 is neutral, and anything above 7.0 is an alkaline or a base. The reproductive tract for the male, testes, epididymis, the vas deferens or ductus deferens, seminal vesicle, prostate gland, penis, and scrotum. We'll do the male reproductive during week 4 when we do endocrine. And the main function of the male reproductive tract is to produce the male sex cell, which is sperm, and to produce hormones and sexual intercourse. The female reproductive organs, primarily the ovaries, that's going to produce the female sex cell, which is the egg or the ovum. Then you have the uterine tubes, which are the fallopian tubes, the uterus, the vagina, the labia, clitoris, and mammary glands, all major organs of the female reproductive tract. Primary function is to produce the oocyte, which is the egg, support development of the embryo from conception to delivery, and to provide milk for nourishment of the newborn through the mammary glands, as well as sexual intercourse. Now let's take a look at some of the superficial anatomy, some of the major landmarks to become familiar with. These are all over your first lab exam under Connect, so you want to be comfortable with some of these terms. And again, it's click and drag, right? You find the word and you drag it to the appropriate place. So when we look at the head right here, the forehead is known as the frontal lobe or the frontal bone. The chin is called mental. The cheek is called buccal. The ear is otic. The eye is orbital or ocular. The head, the entire head, is called cephalic. There's a cranial portion and a facial portion. The neck is called a cervical region. This entire portion here is the trunk. But the trunk is made up of the thoracic region, the mammary or the breast, the abdominal region, and the umbilical region. All of that falls under the trunk. In terms of the upper extremity, the arm is called the brachium. Right in front of the elbow is the antecubital. The armpit is called the axilla or the axillary region. So these terms really are significant because when you hear of, well, where's the cervical vertebrae, that would be here in the neck. When you hear the axillary artery or the axillary nerve or the axillary vein, you know it's got to be running through the armpit. When you hear of the biceps brachii, we know it's going to be somewhere here. When you hear of rectus abdominis, you know it's going to be here. When you hear of the thoracic spine, we know it's got to be somewhere here. When you hear of a muscle called the buccinator, we know it's got to be somewhere associated with the cheek. When you hear of a foramen in the chin called the mental foramen, we know it's got to be a hole in the mandible. When you do neurology and you do a part of the brain called the diencephalon, here is cephalic, which means the brain. Okay. All right, so click and drag, right? This came from Connect a few terms ago. So this is frontal. Here's orbital, nasal, buccal for cheek, otic for ear, mental for chin. Here is the anterior cervical triangle in front of the throat right here. And lateral to the SCM muscle, the sternocleidomastoid, is the lateral cervical triangle, this depression here. The forearm is the antebrachial. The wrist is called carpals. We have carpal bones. You've heard of carpal tunnel syndrome. There are 8 carpal bones. Palm is called palmar. The fingers are called phalanges. The thumb is called pollex or pollicus. The groin is called inguinal. The pubic region is called pubic. The thigh is called femoral. The bone here is called the femur, so femoral. The kneecap is called patella. That's the actual name of the kneecap, patella. The leg is called crural. The ankle is called tarsal. So in the foot, you have tarsals. In the hand, you had carpals. In the hand, the thumb is pollex or pollicus. The great toe of the foot is hallux or hallucus. The toes are called phalanges, just like the fingers were called phalanges. Again, the head is cephalic, the neck is cervical. This is the upper extremity or upper limb. The highest point of the shoulder is called the acromial. The back is called dorsal, like a dorsal fin of a dolphin, right? Dorsal is the back. The back of the elbow is called the olecranon or olecranon. That's the knobby part of the elbow that actually makes contact with a desk or a table if you're leaning on it. The lower back is called the lumbar. The rump is called the gluteal. So when we cover muscles like gluteus maximus, gluteus medius, gluteus minimus, it's the rump right back here. The back of the knee is called the popliteal. The calf is called the sural. The heel is called calcaneal. That's the large heel bone is called the calcaneus. And then underneath the foot is the plantar surface. The plantar surface. Some more terms to be familiar with. Superior and inferior are opposites. Anterior and posterior are opposites. Medial and lateral are opposites. Let me show you these in pictures because it's easier. Proximal and distal are opposites. Superficial and deep are opposites. Contralateral and ipsilateral are opposites. Again, easier to show these on pictures. So here, when we're looking at an individual, if we're looking at the upper extremity, and you're moving closer to the trunk, that's called proximal. If you're moving away from the trunk, or you're moving more distant, that's called distal. So proximal and distal are opposites. Even of the lower extremity, if you're moving closer to the beginning of the trunk, that's proximal. If we move further away, that is distal. Superior and inferior is in relationship to the body as a whole. So if we're moving superiorly, we're moving up, and if we're moving inferiorly, we're moving down. Medial and lateral are opposites. So the nose is medial, the eye is lateral to the nose, the ear is lateral to the eye. If we start at the ear and we move medially, it takes us to the nose. If we look at the hand, the thumb is the first digit, the pointer is the second, third, fourth, and the pinky is the fifth digit. So the most lateral finger is the pollex or the pollicus, and the most medial finger, not middle finger, but medial means closest to the inside, that is the fifth digit or the pinky. Okay. Anterior and posterior. Anterior is the front of the body, posterior is the back of the body. When we move superiorly, we can get to the cranial portion. When we move inferiorly, we can get to the caudal, which means tail. Again, superior and inferior. What was contralateral and ipsilateral? Okay, if the person was in a car accident and is having right shoulder pain, even though this is our reading left, this is her right shoulder, right, anatomical position. So if she has right shoulder pain and ipsilateral wrist pain, it means right shoulder pain and right wrist pain. Ipsi means same. If it's right shoulder pain and ipsilateral and contralateral finger pain, then it's right shoulder and left finger pain. So contralateral, contra is opposite, ipsilateral means the same. Okay, when we look at the abdominal area, we can break the abdominal area up into 4 quadrants. There's a right upper quadrant, the RUQ. There's the left upper quadrant, left lower quadrant, and right lower quadrant. Why are these quadrants important? Because in healthcare, when someone has an intake form, a patient intake form, and they mark up where their discomfort or pain is, if this was the anatomical person and someone marked right here, Then the nurses and doctors communicate with one another by saying the patient indicates that he or she has pain in the right lower quadrant on a scale of 1 to 10, an 11. Okay, so the next question is, well, what structures are located in the right lower quadrant? They're sweating, they're bent over, they have a fever. Well, maybe this right here is inflamed, which is the appendix, the vermiform appendix. Maybe they have an appendicitis. If there's pain in the right upper quadrant and the person is obese and they also have pain in the right scapular region, maybe they have gallstones, right? Cholelithiasis or a gallbladder attack can create pain posterior to the right scapula, but also they can have pain here. Okay, so knowing what structures are located in the quadrants are important in healthcare. Besides the quadrants, we also have 9 regions. When we look at the 9 regions, we could start at the belly button. That's the umbilical region. Epigastric, epi means above, hypo means below. So there's an epigastric, above the stomach, hypogastric, below the stomach. The hypogastric is also close to the pubic region, so they sometimes call it the pubic region. Then we have the left inguinal, which is the left groin, and then you have the right inguinal, which is the right groin region. Then there's the left lumbar and right lumbar. Sometimes these left lumbars and right lumbars are called left flank and right flank. And then you have a left hypochondriac and right hypochondriac. Chondria is ribs and cartilage. So there's the left hypochondriac region and a right hypochondriac region. So on the connect portion, I've seen this pop up before, where again, it's click and drag the proper term with the region. You can always start with the belly button, pop the umbilical region there. Then you got the pubic region down below. Then there's the left groin and right groin. So left inguinal, right inguinal, left flank, left hypochondriac, right hypochondriac. And again, the 9 regions also have specific organs in each of them. Between the regions and the quadrants, most healthcare professionals use the quadrants compared to the regions, but here we can overlap both. You could see the blue line shows the 4 quadrants and the red shows the 9 regions. And again, let's not forget the terminology, proximal distal. Proximal distal, when we're talking about the upper and lower extremities. We're talking about the body in general. We use superior and inferior, and medial versus lateral. Medial is moving closer to midline. Lateral is moving away from midline. Now let's look at planes. When we look at planes, we could divide the body. If we look at this image, we can look at a person from back to front. We can look at the person from the side view, and we can look at them from bird's eye view looking straight down into the body. So we could divide the body into several ways. We have a sagittal plane, which separates the body into a left and right half. So this is what a sagittal plane would divide the body. We could divide the body into a coronal plane, also known as a frontal plane, that separates the body into a front and back half, like this. And then we can divide the body into a transverse plane, cutting the body in half, which will allow us to look straight down into the body, or a bird's eye view. So when we cut the body in half this way, this is the transverse plane. If we were to cut the body straight down the center, that is the mid-sagittal plane. If it's in that same direction up and down, that separates the body into a right and left half, but not equal halves, sometimes they say parasagittal or just sagittal plane. So we can use these different planes to look at the brain. This is a sagittal plane. This is a coronal or a frontal plane, looking at it from back to front. And this is the transverse plane, so we could see a nice healthy view of left and right hemispheres of the brain, as well as the ventricles inside. This is a sagittal plane. This is the tongue right here. This is the cerebrum of the brain. This is the cerebellum. This is the medulla, the pons, the midbrain, the diencephalon. This is your C1 vertebrae and your C2, your C3, the discs. Pretty neat stuff. Some muscles behind the neck. So now here, look at this question. What is the medial border of the highlighted region? Some people just look at the blue and go, that's the right lower quadrant. But look what it's asking. What is the medial border of the highlighted region? So here's the highlighted region. This is lateral. This is superior. This is inferior. What is the medial border, which is here? So the medial border is actually pointing to the mid-sagittal plane. Okay, they're asking 2 bits of information in one question. Pretty neat. Okay, we're going to be finishing up now with body cavities. I think this is our last main topic. The function of body cavities is to protect certain organs from accidents and shocks, and it permits the change in size and shape of some of the organs contained within these cavities. So let's show you what some of these cavities look like. So here we have a thoracic cavity, and the thoracic cavity can be divided into 2 cavities, a pleural cavity, which houses the lungs, and pericardial, peri means around, cardial is heart, and there's this cavity that surrounds the heart. Then we have a muscle called the diaphragm, which separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal pelvic cavity. So here's the diaphragm, here's the abdominal cavity, and then here's the pelvic cavity. The abdominal cavity is mostly for your digestive organs, and the pelvic cavity is mostly for reproductive. We have a ventral cavity, and we have a dorsal cavity, right? Ventral is anterior, dorsal is posterior. So in the dorsal column back here, in the dorsal chamber or dorsal cavity, we have the brain and the spinal cord. And in the ventral or anterior part, we know we have the lungs here, then we have the abdominal organs here, and we have the reproductive organs down in here. So if they were to do a click and drag for dorsal cavity and ventral cavity, again, dorsal cavity here, ventral cavity in here, then in the dorsal cavity is the cranial cavity, the vertebral canal, spinal cord, and the meninges protect the spinal cord. So all these are linked together. In the ventral cavity, we have the abdominal cavity, the diaphragm, the lungs, and the mediastinum. The mediastinum is the only new term that we haven't done yet, so let's take a look at it. Right here is the mediastinum, which is really a passageway for the trachea, some of the major blood vessels that lead into the heart that travel through. The mediastinum is deep or posterior to the sternum, but it's anterior to the spinal column, and it's between the lungs. So that's that area called the mediastinum. It sounds like middle of the sternum, mediastinum. Okay. Now I want to go through 2 terms that I want you to understand the difference between visceral and parietal. Here we're looking at the heart, which is why we see the word pericardium. Visceral and parietal. Visceral means the organ. So if we were to, if this is a balloon, and this is a fist going into the balloon, if the fist pushes into the balloon, this layer right here that's contacting the fist, this would be the visceral layer, and the layer on the outside of that, this layer here, would be the parietal layer. So now let's replace the fist with the heart. So here is the visceral pericardium. Here is the parietal pericardium. And between the visceral pericardium.
Your screen is black. Okay,
Okay.
there you go. Okay, it's back.
It's back. Can you see it again? Can you see it?
Yes, yes, I can see it now.
Thank you. So between the visceral pericardium and the parietal pericardium is this space called the pericardial cavity. And in this pericardial cavity is just fluid, right? Think of how much that heart is beating. Remember I said earlier that muscles generate heat. So this pericardial cavity that's filled with fluid has to cool off the heart, keeps it a little bit cooler. Okay, so this term, visceral and parietal, we're going to use them when we talk about the heart, when we talk about the lungs, and when we talk about the abdominal organs. The only term that we're going to change is when we talk about the lungs, we change pericardium into pleura. And when we talk about the abdominal organs, we change pericardium into peritoneum. But the concept is the same. Whether it's the lungs or the abdominal organs, there's going to be a visceral layer and a parietal layer. Okay, so the visceral layer covers the organ. The parietal layer is going to line the cavity in which that organ is. So if we were to look at the lungs and the heart here, we can see, let's look at the heart again. Here's the heart. The layer that covers the heart is the visceral pericardium. Around the cavity is the parietal pericardium. And then the cavity where the fluid is between both is the pericardial cavity. Same concept applies to the lungs. The part that's inner covering the viscera or the organ is the visceral pleura. Then you have a parietal pleura, and then you have a pleural cavity. So pleura refers to lungs, pericardial refers to the heart. When we talk about the abdominal organs, we're going to use the word peritoneum. Okay, so let's look at the word. There is the word mediastinum that I showed you earlier. So here, what is the highlighted region? Is it the pericardial sac, the fibrous pericardium, parietal pericardium, or visceral pericardium? That would be the visceral pericardium. And now we're going to finish up with the abdominal pelvic cavity. When we talk about the abdominal organs, we're going to use the word peritoneum. Again, there's a visceral peritoneum that's going to cover the abdominal organs, and then a parietal peritoneum that lines the body wall. So here we're looking at a sagittal view of most of the abdominal organs from the side view, so it looks very different. But here's the liver, here's the stomach, here's the large intestine, here's the small intestine at many different levels. So here, around the outside, this blue going all the way around that's lining the cavity, that's the parietal peritoneum. If we were looking at visceral peritoneum, that would be this layer here. Around the stomach, that would be visceral. Around here would be visceral. Okay? Retroperitoneal, this term retroperitoneal would be whatever is behind this. So you see the pancreas? The pancreas and the kidneys, that is retroperitoneal, meaning it's behind this peritoneal cavity. Right? So this is the parietal peritoneum, but looks like the kidneys and the pancreas are behind it. That's why pancreatic cancer is so painful, because when it starts to enlarge, it really gets compressed by these membranes. Okay? Okay, and the pelvic cavity is below the abdominal cavity. That's going to contain reproductive organs, the rectum, and the urinary bladder. Okay, let me stop the recording here.